Hey guys, today I wanted to make a video about my thoughts on Sekiro's combat system. Like all my previous videos on Soulsborne mechanics, it's heavily opinion based and it's meant for discussion. There are no absolute truths here. This video will have some spoilers, so I would recommend you look away if you haven't finished the game. I start this video by quoting an interview Sekiro and Souls director Hidetaka Miyazaki recently gave. The interview states the following: he believes that gameplay is the soul of the game. Once that's in place, he can form a story that fits and augments the experience. That process then influences the story, which also influences the gameplay. You're playing with clay and it slowly comes into focus, Miyazaki explained. Combat is one of the most important contributors to the gameplay on a game such as Sekiro, or the Soulsborne series. Understanding the combat mechanics in Sekiro is in a big part understanding its soul, and how a lot of the game was built around it. Combat in Sekiro is quite different from the one on Soulsborne games. Some people call this game Shinobi Souls, but I feel like some mechanics, especially combat mechanics, make this game unique and stand out from the previous recent From Software games. Sekiro's combat system has its merits, but in my opinion also has its flaws. For me to understand what Sekiro combat is and how it shaped the game, I think it would be useful to compare it to Soulsborne combat. For me, the cornerstones of Soulsborne combat are the following. Endurance. I start by probably the most important one, stamina. Soulsborne combat has its roots on the concept of stamina. Stamina on those games affected how much you could do. Most actions in Soulsborne games like attacking, running, rolling or dodging would reduce your stamina. But a lot of other actions would have an impact on stamina as well. In Dark Souls 3, for example, drinking gases would slow down your stamina regen. Blocking would consume your stamina whenever you got hit, and severely slow down stamina regen if you were blocking while not getting hit. The way you would replenish your stamina was to walk or do nothing. Stamina was the price to pay for acting aggressively or defensively against an opponent. In short, it was the price of action. Some PvE and PvP builds were even based on stamina. In Bloodborne PvP scene, for example, there was a base endurance type of build, in which you would not touch endurance in order to buff your other stats higher. It rewarded a skilled fighting style. If you could manage your stamina better than your opponent, your build would trump theirs. In Dark Souls 3, some PvP builds would have a big emphasis on stamina and its faster regeneration. A popular build was the following: Sellsword Twin Blades with 40 stamina, which was the soft cap, Grass Crest Shield on the back, and Clarenty Ring for added stamina regen, and Ring of Favor to increase the stamina pool over the soft cap. You could apply immense amounts of pressure with this build, because you would have more stamina and recover it faster than any of your opponents. When you look at it, stamina management was the cornerstone of Soulsborne combat. Weapon classes were designed in a big part around its concept. Big weapons would be slower, hit for more damage per swing, but consume bigger chunks of stamina per swing than smaller weapons. You needed to play in a fundamentally different way when using a small or a big weapon, in a big part because of their different stamina expenditures. Stamina also dictated if you should block or dodge, if you should keep pressuring a boss or retreat. Some say that the stamina bar was the really important bar for good Soulsborne players, not the HP bar. Build and weapon diversity. Another cornerstone of Soulsborne combat was build and weapon diversity. In Soulsborne, you could use a huge amount of weapons to get stuff done. Fast weapons, slow weapons, ranged weapons, transformed and untransformed weapons in Bloodborne's case. You name it. You could also do an almost infinite number of builds. In Souls, you could do pyro builds, cleric builds, sorcerer builds and more, depending on the specific game you were talking about, and combine them or not with melee builds. Dark Souls 3, for example, had items that encouraged you to do hybrid spellcasting builds. The Crystal Chime is a good example of a spell catalyst that would allow you the casting of sorceries and miracles. Dark Souls 1 would encourage you to use pyromancies by requiring no investment in fate or intelligence, for example. There are many more examples of this through the Soulsborne series. It was a great incentive to try out new builds and play the game differently, either in PvP or in PvE. Poise. For me, the last cornerstone of Soulsborne combat is poise. Even if it existed on different iterations such as passive poise, as in Dark Souls 1 or 2, although an hybrid system was present in this title, or active poise, aka hyper armor like in Dark Souls 3, Demon Souls or Bloodborne, for some weapons and attacks in this case. In short, poise is the ability of not getting interrupted or staggered when getting hit. Roughly put, The most recent iterations of the poise system on Souls games, aka the one present on Dark Souls 3, exists to make different weapons viable. Dark Souls 3, which in my opinion had the best poise system, was very clear on that. Faster attack weapon classes would have no poise, and so you would always get staggered when hit, no matter how much armor poise you stacked. Slower attack weapon classes would allow you not to be hit out of your animations during your poise frames, unless you were poise broken. It made slower weapons viable against faster weapons. It made big weapons more usable in both PvE and PvP. The existence of poise is in my opinion fundamental to the existence of different playstyles, weapon usages and builds on all Soulsborne games. Now, with all of this in mind, let's take a look at Sekiro and its combat system. Posture. Posture is a new mechanic debuted in Sekiro and absent from Soulsborne games that seems pretty simple, but ends up being more complex than it seems. It ends up making for a very different combat style. Both the player and his opponents have posture bars, but they work in slightly different ways. In both cases, players and opponents should not let the posture meter fill up. For Sekiro, if the posture meter gets full, he will be left in a state of vulnerability for a few moments that I will refer as being guard broken. For opponents, if the posture bar gets full, they are vulnerable to a death blow that will immediately kill them or take away one of its orbs on the top left corner of the screen while resetting his posture. Vitality or HP also affects posture, but again in different ways if you are talking about Sekiro or his opponent. The rule of thumb is the lower the HP, the slower posture recovers. Sekiro's posture, however, recovers much faster than the one of any opponent at the same HP percentage. Sekiro can also replenish his posture by walking or doing nothing, and can recover even faster by blocking while not getting hit. Attacking, running, dodging and using his prosthetic tool will stop posture regeneration for Sekiro. His opponents, however, can only recover posture when not attacking. If they're attacking or performing any other actions, their posture will not regenerate. When Sekiro attacks, his posture will not regenerate, but the posture bar will not get filled either. Only when taking damage, blocking or deflecting will Sekiro posture bar get filled. Note that deflecting will lead to a much smaller posture meter rise than simply blocking. However, even when Sekiro's posture bar is filled, he will not get guard broken if he deflects, not just blocks, all of his following opponent's attacks and is not damaged. When an opponent blocks an attack, gets damaged or has its own attack deflected, not just blocked, his posture bar will fill. It will fill faster if you deflect successive attacks. There is a series of items and skills that the player can use to cause more posture damage or lessen the posture damage received, either by buying different skills with skill points or using different consumables. And what about stamina? Well, there is no stamina in Sekiro, so it would seem that you would be able to continually perform actions. But that is not true because of posture. Posture acts like limitations to your actions, same as stamina does on Soulsborne titles. You see, getting your posture bar in Sekiro totally filled and getting out of stamina in Soulsborne games ends up being very similar. You become vulnerable to counterattack. You also have to manage your posture bar in Sekiro as you have to manage your stamina bar in Soulsborne games. A lot of times in Sekiro, as your posture bar is almost full, you can choose to back off to replenish your posture, the same way as backing off would regenerate your stamina in Soulsborne games, with one difference however. In Sekiro, if you play flawlessly, your posture bar does not matter. By playing flawlessly, I mean deflecting all of your opponent's attacks and never getting damaged. Your posture will never break and it will never cap your actions. However, if your posture bar is full because you're deflecting everything your opponent is doing to you and you miss a single deflect or get damaged, you will get posture broken. This means that it is possible to fight on the edge of getting posture broken with great success. It's a high risk, high reward mechanic that adds a big skill gap, and that I think it's really interesting. You cannot do this with stamina on Soulsborne. In Soulsborne, you are encouraged to play passive to regen stamina with bouts of action, where you deplete your stamina damaging your opponent, blocking or dodging and then backing off to regen. This Sekiro high-risk mechanic and the fact that your opponent's posture also regens encourages aggression and flawless play, in order to always pressure your opponent's posture bar while managing to not get guard broken. Sekiro's combat hinges much more on posture than any other mechanic. On a quick review of the before mentioned Soulsborne mechanics applied to Sekiro, I will say this. Poise. Sekiro does not have poise, passive poise or hyper armor poise, on any attack he can do as far as I can remember. The exception to this is the loaded axe prosthetic tool that can poise through some light attacks. This means that all attacks except from the ones from the prosthetic axe will get interrupted every time an opponent strikes you while you're attacking. If there were other main weapons you could use, maybe you could have some poise weapons that have poise on their R2, for example, like a heavy club. A Shugoki club like in For Honor comes to mind. However, it would have to be intrinsic to the weapon itself. This is because you cannot change armor to give you poise like in some of the Soulsborne titles, or change your build. Also, poise in Soulsborne titles, except for Bloodborne, due to the transformative nature of the weapons, has trade-offs. You need to build your build around it. Because poise is a very foreign concept to Sekiro, you would have to rebalance the game for a poise main weapon to exist, as having a weapon with hyper armor could trivialize a lot of the fights, especially fights against some weaker mobs. Sekiro does this trade-off with the loaded axe by making you have to spend spirit emblems in order to have poise. Because of this, I believe a main poise weapon would be hard to fit in Sekiro with the current mechanics in the game. Build and weapon diversity. Sekiro has very low weapon diversity and build diversity. You will always fight with the same katana, and except for a couple of combat arts that use a different weapon, that's it. Most diversity comes from the skills you choose, combat arts and prosthetic tools. However, as you can change combat arts or prosthetic tools from a paused menu, there are not really builds in an RPG sense of the word, especially in the endgame, as you don't really have to do any choices. You can have them all, and so there are very little trade-offs, and hence I wouldn't say there are really any builds in the game. This lack of diversity makes fights much easier to program, as devs have many less variables to worry about. This in turn makes fights much more controlled, and that makes the posture system really shine. This said, even with such a low variety, a lot of boss fights can be cheesed really easily, which really should have been taken in account by the devs. Yeah, I'm looking at you, Corrupted Monk. All of this to say that Sekiro combat hinges a lot on posture, and very lightly on the other Soulsborne cornerstones of combat. But what are the advantages of Sekiro's combat relatively to the one on Soulsborne games? Well, Sekiro allows for really hectic fights in a way that Soulsborne can't. It's much more about acting and reacting very quickly to your opponent while keeping the pressure up. Most of your opponent's attacks are really hard to dodge as well, as opponents have excellent tracking, especially on the later stages of the game. You are encouraged to stand your ground by deflecting or countering your opponent's moves and identify what are your opponent's moves that allow you to get one or two hits in. You are taught to exploit your opponent's weaknesses much more than play to your build strengths like in Soulsborne, because there are really no builds in Sekiro. The lack of builds and the fact that players are expected to play in a certain way, encouraged by the game's mechanics, provide a similar experience to all players. This is both good and bad. The good part is that there are no weapons or builds that make the game significantly easier or harder. It falls to the player and to the player alone to learn all about your opponent and improve. This increases the feel of accomplishment when you down a hard boss. You killed that boss, not your build. Another good thing is that the posture system really encourages an aggressive playstyle in a way that a stamina-based combat system can't. Not button mashing, mind you, it rewards controlled aggression. And as I've mentioned before, if you play flawlessly, you can ignore your own posture bar, as it will never get broken. It rewards a very skilled hand more than any Soulsborne game. Fights against humanoids feel better in Sekiro than any humanoid fights in any Soulsborne game, in my opinion. There is a lot more depth to be had in these fights, and you feel that you can go toe-to-toe against these bosses. Most of the bosses are not enormous opponents that you hit on their ankles. It feels much closer to a PvP fight than any previous Soulsborne bosses. And by the way, it's no wonder that no Dark Souls 3 boss is a humanoid with similar abilities to you. This stems from the combat system itself, in my opinion. The closest you can get for that PvP feel are some enemies such as the trio at the stairs of the Grand Archive, Wilhelm in Ariandel, and the times you are invaded by NPCs. This is also true in Bloodborne, but to a lesser degree, as there are more humanoid fights on that game, such as Maria, Gascoigne or German, but they are much more stronger versions of what you can do as a player. By this I mean that you cannot go toe-to-toe with him, you have to treat them like any other boss and play around them. 1v1s feel very tense and impactful. Any enemy in the game can kill you with ease if you are not careful. Sekiro teaches you to really think in how you should engage an area or strong opponent, because it takes time to break through your opponent's defenses because of the posture and the relatively low damage you can do to your opponents, either because of their big health bars or because of them blocking everything you do. It favors careful assessment of the situations and encourages you to disengage with your grappling hook or any other method if the situation escalates out of your control. It really encourages you to look at the world from the point of view of a shinobi. About the disadvantages of Sekiro's combat relatively to combat on Soulsborne games. Scripted fights. Fights in Sekiro sometimes feel more akin to a rhythm game than a Soulsborne fight. Thrusting unblockable, then do a Mikiri counter. Slicing unblockable, then just jump and stomp. Chain of attacks, deflect. It's very ritualistic and can lose its allure after 1 or 2 playthroughs. Once you know what the boss is about to do because you died to it a lot of times, it's just a matter of staying calm and executing. It feels a bit stale after a while. This is compounded because you can only fight bosses with the same tools. After a while, there are no choices, no variables, and the game feels stale. Fights against non-humanoid mini-bosses and bosses feel somewhat weird. There are few compared to Soulsborne games because the posture system really doesn't seem to be well suited for these fights. I think there are like 15 bosses in Sekiro which give memories. Excluding the folding screen monkeys and the divine dragon, which are gimmicky types of bosses, a bit like the wyvern or Yorm in Dark Souls 3, that leaves us with 13 bosses. Of these, 9 are humanoid. The exceptions are the Demon of Hatred, Guardian Ape, and Headless Ape with its companion, and Gyobu Oniwa. If we look at the mini-bosses, the pattern is the same. The game tries to steer away from non-humanoid bosses and mini-bosses, as those fights feel a bit out of place in Sekiro. I want to illustrate this point in Sekiro with the fight against the Demon of Hatred. This one is the closest you can get to a Soulsborne boss in this game, and for me it seems out of place in Sekiro. Because there is no stamina and you can attack as much as you like, as posture is not really a factor on that fight, the boss ends up being a damn attack sponge. I didn't like that fight nearly as much as the humanoid fights in the game. It didn't really make me feel accomplished or powerful. The posture system seems to limit the type of bosses that you end up fighting, and in the end the boss fights end up feeling much more similar to one another than the boss fights in Soulsborne games. The lack of builds and main weapons severely limits how players can play the game. This is compounded by the posture system. This means that if you don't like to play with a katana or in your opponent's face through the posture system, tough luck. It's either this or go play another game. This aspect undoubtedly makes the game a pretty repetitive experience, hurting its longevity, especially on higher NG cycles as you face the same bosses with the same movesets with the exact same build. Playing against several opponents feels really bad in Sekiro. The posture system really shines on 1v1s, but feels bad on 2v1s or more fights. It lacks the flexibility of the stamina system. The fact that you don't have an hyper armor main weapon or a large weapon to hit several players only compounds this problem of the game. The posture system works badly against several opponents because situations become exponentially more complex the more opponents you add to a fight. You need to care about their attacks, each of your opponent's HP bar, each of your opponent's posture bar, your own posture bar, your own HP, as well as deflecting your opponent's attacks and manage to attack them as well. In a stamina system, although the complexity of the situation increases, the more opponents you are fighting, it increases much slower. You basically have to care about your stamina, your HP, and your opponent's HP while trying to get some attacks in. The game acknowledges this issue by creating situations where you don't really have to fight several opponents at the same time. Against mobs, you can simply disengage and reset fights and pick your opponents one by one. Or if those mobs are weak ones, you can just overpower them, but that is rare. Against bosses, the only one in the game in which you are forced to fight against 2 opponents is the second ape fight against Headless Ape and its companion. I'm not counting the first phase of the dragon fight here, as the level of challenge there is really low. That said, the ape companion has a much smaller health bar than the headless ape, making the fight much easier. Looking at mini-bosses, the same applies. You can make every fight a 1v1 with relative ease, as there is always a gimmicky way to avoid a 2v1. However, this only masks the problem, it doesn't solve it. Fighting several opponents at the same time in Soulsborne was a fun part of the game that is absent from Sekiro because of the game's combat design choices, namely posture versus stamina. Multiplayer. The posture system is in a big part incompatible with the multiplayer experience, either for co-oping or in PvP, and so it makes sense that those features are not in the game. You can experience how awkward this feels when using the puppeteer ninjutsu technique. The enemy AI goes haywire, attacks from your opponent become harder to predict, and the controlled aggression encouraged by the posture system goes through the door. It becomes an R1 mash fest to the point of me not knowing if it was really worth to use the puppeteer technique or not. On the PvP side of things, I think it was a good decision for it not to be implemented on this game. I have a feeling that it would feel horrendous. Because of how fast-paced the game is and how important deflecting is for the posture system, I predict it would be a terrible experience if there was the smallest amount of latency. Also, because of the grappling hook, any of the players could simply disengage and heal or grief if in an invasion scenario. Even in a dual type of PvP, the lack of builds and weapon choices would make for a very lackluster experience in my opinion. However, the lack of multiplayer severely limits the longevity of the game. Multiplayer was the reason a lot of Soulsborne players still played those games. I will make a future video about longevity of this game on this channel. My conclusion is that the game was developed with the posture system in mind. I would even say that it centers around it mechanics-wise. It sits well with the shinobi theme of the game, but it definitely has its advantages and shortcomings. In my opinion, the posture system is a really inflexible one, and works only in a very controlled environment that allows very low build and weapon diversity, limiting replayability, and only really feels good on 1v1s against humanoid enemies. I also feel like this system is really hard to adapt for multiplayer, either for co-op or PvP. Because of this posture system is so restrictive, I believe this system to be a one-off for Sekiro, except for a possible Sekiro sequel. This said, the first playthrough of this game was the hardest and most fun I've ever had on a From Software game. Finding the boss's weaknesses and learning to counter them with my toolkit made for a brilliant initial experience. And that's it for me. Tell me your thoughts. Do you like Sekiro's combat system? Do you think it could be improved? Do you think that it will be present in future From Software games? And finally, do you think they should add PvP to Sekiro? If so, what type of PvP? Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this video and I'll see you next time. Raven out.